So I'm just going to get right into it. This is going to be one of the hardest videos that I have ever shot. And it's not because of something massive that's happened to me, though there is technically a bit of a change in perspective that has happened that has colored how I'm going to approach this video. Now, for those of you who have followed my channel for a while, you'll know that I have a video called There Are 10 Steps to Genocide. And in that video, I articulate many of the things that have happened to the trans community in the last few years that can be labeled as steps towards genocide. I want to go ahead and make the case today, as much as it is not going to be easy to. I want to make the case today that I think we've actually gone through every single step. And I want to start that off by asking you, if you were an organization that learned from history, that learned that the world, on the whole, responded to the idea of genocide by sending militaries into a country and taking it down, what lesson would you take from that? There are a couple lessons you can take from it. One is that people on the whole do not like it when a country is involved in a mass killing, and therefore you probably shouldn't do those things, based solely on the understanding that most of us are not really big fans of those things. But there's another lesson that could be learned there. And it's the lesson that if you're going to engage in a genocide, you need to make it as invisible as humanly possible. Now, again, I know I've probably lost a lot of people if you're watching on YouTube. Either some of you have hopped off because there's a cartoon avatar with a bunch of Vulpixes behind him and a chat box there, so obviously this can't be a well-prepared video because it's a live stream by an amateur. For those of you who are still here despite all that, thank you very much. And for those of you who are here despite readily typing away in the comments how there is no genocide happening in the United States, you would know if there is one. I'd like to point out that most of the regular citizens in Germany wouldn't have called what they were doing genocide until everything had already gone down. So let's go ahead and make sure that it's abundantly clear. Nobody who is actively involved in the, in the act of a genocide is going to actively say that they are. But that said, let me go ahead and show you all where my argument is coming from primarily. So these are the stages of genocide. These are effectively irrefutable. These are the things that you look for when determining if a genocide is happening. And the reason I say these are effectively irrefutable is these are based entirely on experts who have studied acts of genocide everywhere. A couple things to get out of the way real quick. A genocide does not have to be successful to be a genocide. Jewish people still exist, but a genocide still happened during the Holocaust, as an example. Also, a genocide does not need to be at the stage of extermination to be a genocide, but hopefully I can at least convince some of you all that we are at the red flag area of stage 9, at least to a degree. Again, I will get to there, I promise. But first of all, let's go ahead and read through what each of these stages say so that we can figure out kind of why I am coming to where I am. So stage 1 is the classification of a people. This is where differences between people are not respected. There is a division of us versus them, which can be carried out using stereotypes or excluding people who are perceived to be different. Now, this is a hard one for most people to grapple around because it feels like such a low bar. But remember, this is stage 1, and it is not necessary for any of these stages to necessarily scale into the next ones. But I think, well, let me just show you where my argument is coming from for this one. So this is HB 3817 in Texas. This is a House bill that has a very, very simple goal. And, well, despite it being a very simple goal, if you read it, you'll see what the end effect is supposed to be. A bill to be entitled, an act relating to the creating of the criminal offense of gender identity fraud, be it enacted by the legislature of the state of Texas, Section 1, Subchapter D, Chapter 32, Penal Code, is amended by adding Section 3.515 to read as follows. Gender identity fraud. A person commits an offense if the person knowingly makes a false or misleading verbal or written statement to a governmental entity or the person's employer by identifying the person's biological sex as the opposite of the biological sex of the person at birth. Now, bear in mind that the Trump administration has argued that biological sex and gender are to mean the same thing, and anything that refers to one should refer to the other, before you go typing away in the comment sections there. Part B of this says, an offense under this section is a state jail felony, and the act takes effect September 1st, 2025. A state jail felony for being trans. We're not going to talk about neopronouns or people who are gender fluid or any of the other complicated esoteric bits that we could possibly talk about here. We're just talking about a trans person, a person who has, at some point in their life, decided that the thing the doctor said they were is not the thing that they are. They have made that decision as an adult, or they made that decision as a minor and did not act upon that decision until being an adult, or any number of ways that you can argue this. Most of the trans people I know began their therapies and everything well into adulthood. So we are talking about adults. Anybody who tries to argue that this is about children is wrong, because there is no part about this bill that cares about children. To argue that this is not stage one, at the very least, a classification, and us versus them, a way to force people to choose a category, and choosing the wrong category causes them to get sent to a jail cell, you would be blatantly incorrect. I would also like to argue that there is a trend with Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Texas, and Tennessee, and Virginia, that when one of these laws successfully passes in the House or Senate of any of those states, copycat laws are enacted in each of our states directly afterwards. So any argument that this is only happening in Texas, I don't want to hear it, because history shows that that doesn't fucking matter. Now, the next stage is symbolization. This is a visual manifestation of hatred. Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe were forced to wear the Yellow Star of David. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge were forced from the Eastern Zone to wear blue scarves. From 1992, in northwest Bosnia, all non-Serbian citizens were forced to wear armbands. Now, let me make this argument very clear. Let me make this argument very clear. The transgender flag's existence is not an act of authoritarian symbolization. It's not. But the fact that it exists means it can be used that way. While we have not had forced symbolization in a way that I fully can articulate right now, we do 100% have a symbol that can be used very quickly, and it's ready right there, and There are plenty of trans people who will wear this with pride, much like there are plenty of Jewish people who already would be perfectly fine wearing a Star of David. And then the minute that this gets used against them, as we go further down the stages of genocide, is where things get a lot more icky. Your third stage is discrimination. This is where a dominant group denies civil rights or even citizenship to identified groups. The 1935 Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their German citizenship and made it illegal for them to do many jobs or to marry German non-Jews. Now, all that is required here is for civil rights to be denied for a minority group. There are, in 2025, 687 anti-trans bills active in every single state, 17 of which in this year alone have passed. Any argument that we are not in stage 3 is 100% incorrect, evidenced entirely by the fact that we have already been doing this. We have already been trying to remove civil rights from trans people. The ability to gain your passports with your chosen name, your chosen gender, has been revoked from trans people. The ability to vote has been argued to be revoked from anybody whose name does not coincide with the name on their birth certificate, which just so happens to be something that a lot of trans people fall into the category of. And of course, telling a trans person that they are not allowed to say what their gender is 110% an anti-trans law. It is discrimination in every way, shape, and form. The next stage is dehumanization. Those who are perceived as different are treated with no form of human rights or personal dignity. It specifies that during the genocide in Rwanda, Tutsis were referred to as cockroaches, and the Nazis referred to Jews as vermin. So, how do you get dehumanization of trans people in the United States? Well, we can define dehumanization as the process of depriving a person or a group of their positive human qualities. So what would be more dehumanizing than being told that one of the most basic things you would like to participate in, a sport, needs to be revoked from you because you are less than the cis girls in those sports? California schools and families hurt by transgender athlete controversy denounce Newsom for enabling this crisis in the first place. Tucker Carlson saying that transgenderism is the most dangerous extremist movement in the United States. CPAC speaker calling for the eradication of transgenderism. This, of course, was Michael Knowles calling for the elimination of transgenderism. Any argument whatsoever that none of this points to an attempt at dehumanizing trans people would in the same breath never want any of this to happen to their child. It would be considered dehumanizing of Christians to say that we need to eliminate all Christians from the United States. They would be seen as vermin. They would be seen as lambs to a slaughter. It's in fact part of the language that Christians have used for years to describe themselves in the first place. So why, when the shoe is on a different foot, does it feel like it fits any different? It shouldn't. And that leaves us to stage 5, organization. Now it says here genocides are always planned. Regimes of hatred often train those who go to carry out the destruction of a people. Now, there are a couple things that I want to bring up here. The first one is how often drag shows, trans people, etc., are labeled as pedophiles in the media, while at the same time groups labeling them as pedophiles sell merchandise saying kill your local pedo. Now, while we don't have any link to being transgender and being a pedophile in any scientific data whatsoever, that never matters. It never matters. Not ever once. That was the argument that I used when I made my original video on this, and I still want to stick by that argument. But I think I have one other argument for the Organization Against Trans People. Once again, you do not enact 687 bills in 49 states unless there is a well-organized and concerted effort against a group of people. There is no such thing as an unorganized movement that has proposed this much legislation. And any argument to the contrary is in full denial of reality. Because I can show you the reality sourced directly in front of you. Now, stage 6 is polarization. This is where groups begin making propaganda. The propaganda can come in a variety of forms. It can be even have a ton of levity. Hell, look at a lot of anti-Jewish propaganda in early Germany during the Weimar Republic. A lot of the anti-Jewish propaganda from then doesn't look like it's calling for genocide. It just has to exist. It just has to exist. So I wonder if we can find any major funded groups from the United States that have been creating anti-trans propaganda. Well, I don't know what else you would consider the What is a Woman movie from Matt Walsh. I don't know what else you would consider Lady Ballers from the Daily Wire. And in fact, I think you'll find that I'm not the only one calling these films propaganda, and anti-trans propaganda at that. All that is needed for my argument to hold water, the only thing that is needed, is for it to exist. And if I can point to it existing, it is 100% there. And there it is. And these are not small independent creators. These are multimillionaires who are in the exact same groups as everybody else in the Trump administration right now. The propaganda is being created. And the propaganda doesn't have to be made by the state to serve its purpose. Disney made World War II propaganda. It simply needs to exist. Then we get to stage 7. This is your preparation. Perpetrators plan the genocide. They often use euphemisms, such as the Nazi phrase, the final solution, to cloak their intentions. Acts of genocide are disguised as self-defense, as if there is an ongoing armed conflict. From the White House itself, defending women from gender ideology, restoring the biological truth to our government and executive order. It's always framed as self-defense. It's always framed with a euphemism. We're just defending women. And we're not trying to eliminate trans people. We're defending them from gender ideology. And if we're going to go ahead and bring up the grandpappy of most genocidal arguments, I can do that too. We're not against Jews. We're against national Jewry. Anybody who's done even a small bit of studying of Hitler's regime should have had a red flag pop up in their brain the minute I said those words. because they remember those words being used when they were studying the genocide that happened in Germany. Now, your next stage is persecution. Victims being identified by their ethnicity or religion. Death lists are drawn up. People are sometimes segregated into ghettos, deported or starved, and property is often expropriated. Now, this one, you may think we're not at. However, as of right now, when people try to get their names changed for passports, their names get put on lists. As of right now. Lists of trans people are, in fact, being drawn up. And again, I'm going to use this argument once more. There is no word for 687 bills being proposed against you as an individual other than persecution. There is no word to describe this other than that. An attempt to identify these would-be victims. And while the definitions of genocide try to argue that this is only for ethnicity or religion, I would argue that as long as you have a targeted group and there is an attempt, it is 100% that. So, where does that leave us? Because the scary part is me getting a BattleNet notification for some reason, of all things. The scary part is supposed to be extermination. This is the part. This is the part I argued we weren't at the last time that I did this video. Stage 9 is extermination. The hate group murders their identified victims in a deliberate and systematic campaign of violence. Now, what did I say when I began this video? What did I argue in the beginning of this video? If you wanted to enact a genocide in the modern day with all of the surveillance we have, all of the documentation, all the news organizations, all of the independent media, everything, how would you do that? Very simple. You would make it invisible. We go back to the Texas bill once more. If we make it a jailable offense to simply be yourself, what's the quietest way you can kill someone? Very simply. No. Not even the death penalty, undead rodent. No. Very simply put, you let the victims eliminate themselves. It's a beautiful solution, is it not? You didn't do it. They did it. There was something in their house that needed sorting out, not yours. There was something that they needed to solve, not you. How do you exterminate a group in 2025? In the most effective but invisible way possible? You cause a 72% increase in their suicide rates. And how do you do that? By putting forth every single ounce of legislation you possibly can to make them want to. Demonize them to their parents. Demonize them to their friends. Demonize them to their siblings. Demonize them to their coworkers. Demonize them to their managers. Demonize them to their bosses. Demonize them to the politicians, and demonize them to the constituents that vote for those politicians. Researchers at the Trevor Project have published a study in the peer-reviewed journal Nature, Human Behavior that found that anti-transgender state-level laws has had a significant and causal impact on suicide risk among transgender and non-binary young people across the United States. Now, just to give you an idea of the number difference here, from 2018 to 2022, 48 anti-transgender laws were enacted in the United States across 19 different state governments. 48 across 19 states. We are now looking at 687 across 49 states. We are 2 months into the year, and 17 of them have passed. That means that by the end of this year, if these statistics hold true, 100 bills will pass. Double the amount of bills in 1 year against one group of people that make up 1% of the population. An 800% increase in the frequency of these bills passing than in the last time this was studied across a 4-year margin. This groundbreaking study offers robust and indisputable evidence to support what we've already known. The recent wave of anti-transgender laws in the U.S. is quite literally risking the lives of young people across the country. From a scientific perspective, studying the phenomenon of how these policies impact LGBTQ+ young people's mental health is relatively new. In our analysis of data collected from more than 61,000 transgender and non-binary youth across 5 years, this study critically confirms, for the first time, a causal relationship between anti-transgender laws and heightened suicide risk among transgender and non-binary people. But were it just me saying this? Were it just me saying this, that would not be enough. Not in a billion years. Not at all. I am too small of a channel. And of course, this is where I want to say, hey, maybe subscribe, maybe support what I'm doing, maybe go send this video to a friend if you haven't been able to convince them that this is what's happening. I say all those things not just because I want my argument heard, but because it helps me do the thing that I need to do to survive. But were it just me, this would just be my crackpot theory, and that would be that. But if there was a red flag alert for the anti-trans agenda of the Trump administration, specifically from the Lincoln Institute, who put that red flag alert up because, well, that means that we have hit a stage of genocide, maybe that would add a few bits of weight to my words. The Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention and Human Security condemns the anti-trans agenda of the second Trump administration and warns Americans of the recent spate of executive orders, which are in line with a genocidal process against the transgender community that has been emerging in the United States for over a decade. They are meant to pave the way for greater state repression against all individuals and other groups in the future. It is important to consistently and loudly reject this administration's efforts to isolate any people or groups due to their identities, to reaffirm the United States' commitment to individual rights and diversity, and to push back against efforts to normalize state repression and violence. The Lemkins Institute believes that current anti-trans hysteria within the government is meant to serve three purposes within a wider genocidal process. First, the executive orders constitute the paper marginalization and the paper persecution of an identity group that has recently gained rights and greater acceptance in order to lock in evangelical support for the Trump administration. Second, the executive orders create a fictitious cosmic enemy that will justify the radicalization of the government in general, leading to ever more power for the executive branch. And third, the executive orders over time aim to normalize the destruction of identity groups by desensitizing the public to state-sponsored persecution of people based solely on their identities. Taken together, the Trump admin's executive orders related to trans people would effectively destroy, if fully implemented, trans people as a group. In whole, to summarize the text of the Genocide Convention, the orders begin the process of removing a trans presence from collective life and preventing trans people from existing as themselves. We go back to the Texas bill once more. This forces them back into invisibility and isolation. This attack on trans identity is reminiscent, in the United States context, of the Native American boarding schools, where the goal was to kill the Indian to save the man. Not only would the effort deprive trans Americans of gender-affirming health care and constitute a form of torture and medical malpractice, with terrible mental health repercussions, but also such measures are a common phase in genocidal processes and are generally used to lead to greater persecution. Trump's language denying the reality of trans identity and criminalizing its expression is similar to Russian President Putin's language regarding Ukrainian identity and Israel's language regarding Palestinian identity. These three states each deny the identity of clearly visible, historically continuous groups. Identity denial is a genocidal tactic aimed at vanquishing what is believed to be an evil, existential, and inherently criminal foe, and it always results in mass atrocity if it is not nipped in the bud. While the latter two cases of Russia and Israel involved imperialist land claims, in the case of the Trump admin, anti-trans policies, the goal is rather to achieve victory over an internal enemy, the perceived virus of, quote, woke ideology, of which United States conservatives believe trans people are the primary carriers. Many conservatives are convinced that there is an ideology called transgenderism that is supporting a global totalitarian project that aims to destroy family bonds and render humanity enslaved to a global government and economic exploitation. And that thinking is now in power in the White House. And if you don't think that thinking is pervasive in propagandic groups, again, Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire specifically stated that we need to engage in the elimination or the eradication of transgenderism, and then tried to say that this is not calling for the elimination of transgender people. But there's no way that you could do that. You cannot eliminate Christianity without eventually trying to get rid of all of the Christians. It is simply not possible. You can't get rid of atheism without, at some point, having to kill the atheists who don't convert. Were it just me arguing that this is a thing that the administration is doing, then yeah, you could write me off as the next Alex Jones crackpot. And I wouldn't even fault you for it. But it's not just me. It's globally respected organizations who make it their job to research this. I gathered all of my examples for this on my own, independently. But people who are not working autodidactically as a single individual, who have academic backing far and above what I have, experts in their field, are saying the same thing. It's not just me saying it. There are 10 steps to genocide, and there is one more step that you, yes, you, have probably actively engaged in. This step can only happen after step 9 has already happened. I believe we are at step 9. But we are at step 9 in a way that most people would not consider. People can argue that we are at step 9 of genocide for the Gazans because, of course, Israel is actively trying to hunt them down. We can argue that we are at step 9 for the Ukrainians because, obviously, Russia is trying to eliminate them. But my argument for step 9 here is that a smart administration that wants to eliminate people without dealing with global backlash would do so invisibly. They would do so utilizing a method that they are able to wipe their hands clean from. And persecuting people to the point where they kill themselves or are otherwise fully eliminated from society because they are too afraid to come out into that society, that is most certainly enough for me to support a stage 9 hypothesis. But what is stage 10? Well, stage 10 is denial. The perpetrators, or later generations, deny the existence of any crime. Evidence gets destroyed, witnesses get intimidated. There's also been an increase of Holocaust denial in recent years. This goes back to Nick Fuentes' cookie problem. If you've ever heard that, I can summarize it for you, though. We have 5 years to bake 6 million cookies, and we only have a handful of cookie factories. And even if we were cooking multiple cookies in every oven all the time, I can't possibly think of a way that we would be able to cook 6 million cookies in such a short amount of time. It just doesn't seem statistically feasible. Now, of course, you replace cookies with Jewish people and the factories with the camps and the ovens with the various ways that, including ovens, that Jewish people were killed, and you see where the cookie question was going. It is a form of denialism. Stage 10 happens all the way throughout the genocide while the steps are being taken. Our government is bandying around each of these steps for funsies. And then, of course, people like Michael Knowles are denying that any of that's even happening in the first place. Again, I can provide you, and have in this video, a concrete example for every single one of my claims. If your goal in the comment section is to tell me I'm wrong, then you better have a damn good reason. The most you might be able to say is, I sound arrogant. And you're right. I do sound arrogant. I sound arrogant because I'm right. And I know I'm right. So what do we do? That's the fun part, right? What do we do about all this? Well, when there's not a violent regime coming down on you yet, when there's not a violent regime coming down on you, you are very limited in the ways that you can fight back. In fact, I would argue that we are incredibly limited in the ways that we can fight back. But there are a few ways that we can fight back. Here's the basic one. Here's the basic one. There is r/50501. You can go here. There are people who are constantly posting places that they are wanting to organize, get together, get connected, and protest. You can actually do this over on Mobilize as well, right over here. Now, I'm going to let you know that my opinion on protests is very simple. They do not change dick all. Protests are a way to organize people together so that they together can have a moment of grieving, a moment of shared identity. In this way, I would argue that protest is a step one. You go to a protest, you meet people, and then you use that as a springboard to plan other action afterwards. Obviously, you can participate in multiple protests. Feels good. There's nothing wrong with that. But once more, a protest doesn't do anything. It puts people together, and it lets a message get out there if the media is paying attention to you. And sometimes getting the media to pay attention to you requires things like burning down a Wendy's, which moves it from a protest to a riot. But I do think that organizing to do so still has its use, because many of you feel isolated. Many of you feel atomized. Many of you in this audience likely feel so fragmented from your fellow American that you wouldn't even know how to talk to them in the slightest. Hell, I know without games like Magic the Gathering, I wouldn't know how to either. This is where the other half of Mobilize comes in. Mobilize, and by another bit of extension, the Democratic Socialists of America, can be used to get you in contact with your local Democratic chapters or your local Socialist chapters. Now, to those of you who are not part of my regular audience, but have still stuck it through to this end of the video, you've probably heard the word socialist and put up your red flags. I'll do another video on what socialism is and why it's a good thing if you want me to, but the end thing that I will say is you've probably got a lot of dirty words that your government has told you were bad, but your government is currently engaging in a genocide, so maybe they're not the biggest arbiters of what's good and what's bad right now. Just saying. These websites, Mobilize and Democratic Socialists of America, can get you involved in your local communities and local chapters of people who are politically involved. If you don't know what to do, get involved in these organizations. Trust me, people who have been doing this for years in these orgs will help you know what to do. They will help you know where protests are happening. They will help you know which people they are trying to back politically. And if your goal is to do what I think you should be doing, and that is taking away power from the Democrats that are currently in office by replacing them with people that still have the D tag for voting reasons, but are going to actively fight against this genocide, as opposed to sit back and say, I don't know what we can even do, which has been said by major Democrats in the last 2 months, which has pissed me off. This is your way of taking that power away from them. You get to be directly involved with the canvassers that push them, and you can be directly involved in being the person the canvassers push. This gives you a maximum amount of power over those politicians that are trying to win over their various districts. Then, if your goal is to talk to the current people in power, your two options that I would use are 5calls and ResistBot. Both of these can be used to get in contact with your various representatives, and both of these can be used to spam them with how you feel about recent anti-trans legislation. Make it a habit to go over to the anti-trans bill tracker and see which bills are currently being used. Figure out the names of those bills. They're always numbered. They're always public. Figure out who sponsored those bills, whichever one you want to argue against, and then go on to 5calls and ResistBot and give that politician hell. I am saying harass the fuck out of them. If they want to be part of a genocidal process, then they can be part of the reason they're talking to their... Then you can be part of the reason that they are having to talk to a goddamn therapist. So, There are obviously other things that you could be doing that I have not listed here. If you have any ideas that you want to put forward, I check my comment section. Feel free to let me know in the comment section below. But let's go ahead and get one thing clear. We have gone through every single stage to at least some degree, and it's only going to get worse from here. So your two options right now, if you are in America, are fight for your rights or leave. The other options are death. Don't be part of a statistic. That is what these people have been aiming for from the beginning. If you want to check out me covering stuff like this in the future, please consider going over to either my Twitch channel or my YouTube channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. There's ways to support the channel if you want. I also talk about magic if you want to get away from these kinds of conversations. As always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. I really could not do any of this without all of you. Those of you watching, and especially those of you who support me on Patreon. I wanted to go ahead and take a minute to thank all of you who do that, because with YouTube being what it is these days, I really cannot do this full-time without the support from each and every one of you. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Britzkrieg, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravalern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Tales of Atonement, Nixie Chan, Kiri Artemis, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that, Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fireshard. Thank you so very much. But since you're here, why not go ahead and try watching another one? There should be one that's on the screen right now. And if you are a patron of mine, I wanted to go ahead and thank you again for all of your support. There is still a video you could press though, if you'd like. I would appreciate it just a little bit.